Hello there, let me know if you can hear me. Can you hear me like this? I'll have the chat open in a sec. And you should also be able to see me. Okay, perfect. So I haven't streamed in quite a while, so I need to check a couple things with the setup. Let's just very quickly do the delay test. I set YouTube to low latency. Let's see if that helps. So I will count to 3 and then snap my fingers. And as soon as you hear it on your end, just spam something in the chat, okay? Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I see. So it actually corresponds exactly to the delay I see in my preview here. So finally, let me check how it looks for you guys if I show my desktop, which you should see now. Oops. Let me know if you can see that well. Okay, perfect. So we're gonna stay in this mode most of the time. I think I just show my desktop. Should I forget to switch to anything, or you can't see something that I'm talking about, you can't hear anything, the stream quality gets bad, just let me know in chat. I'll have an eye on that. And otherwise we are good to go. Usually it takes a couple minutes for people to really arrive, and I don't want to mention anything important right away, so I thought I'd just do a bit more of an intro about the kind of 2 things which inspired me to do this hopefully interesting series of live streams. So first, I mean, I hope you're all doing okay given the situation that is currently kind of affecting the whole world, which is pretty crazy that there can even be such an event. Out of all the coverage on it, one of the first really interesting ones for me was this article by the Washington Post, because it was one of the first articles of a major newspaper that I saw that not only had nice graphs, but they actually went ahead and built a full simulation of a very simple virus spreading between people in this kind of simplified 2D setting, which is of course a strong or let's rather a very loose approximation of reality, but still it gives you quite a bit of intuition for something that is hard to understand intuitively, namely how exponentials really work and how small differences in behavior or environmental decisions like quarantining people, how well the quarantine is implemented and so on, can really affect the outcome quite dramatically. So I already linked this this article in my blog post where I announce these live streams. If you're more interested in when to kind of play around or watch it yourself, I highly recommend doing that. A bit later though, I found a video from one of my favorite YouTubers, 3Blue1Brown, who kind of took this a step further, also starting with this kind of simple 2D model of people infecting each other. And I hope it's okay that I'm kind of showing his content here, but going quite a bit more into detail, first explaining his model pretty rigorously, and then modeling different kinds of behavior changes that people can do, and also taking into account effects like that everyone is actually going to a central point, like a market represented by the center square here, and how that affects things, already taking the model from just a simple 2D map of points running around to something more complicated, or in this case here, having several communities with members interchanging and how that affects the spread. So this is already all quite interesting, but obviously I was thinking that with Citybound we kind of already have a model that's way more detailed than just blobs randomly moving, because of course the actual patterns of how people move through a city are quite important for how a virus like the coronavirus spreads. And someone brought it up on Reddit that you could simulate something like a virus with Citybound, and I actually remembered that a long time ago, it has to be like 3+ years, when I was really thinking in detail about how to simulate the individuals moving around and which properties they have and so on, that it would be quite simple to model something like a virus outbreak. And being reminded by this Washington Post article and 3 Blue 1 Brown's video, as well as the poster on Reddit, kind of all these details and ideas from back then came back to mind, and I really got an itch to try to build that. And I thought it would be something quite concrete and nice to do in the live streams that, as I mentioned in the blog post, also would cover some areas which I wanted to get to anyways, like for example implementing pedestrians. So in my blog post I said that I might need to branch off from my current work in progress state of Citybound, because it's not really running right now, and there's a bunch of stuff in the process of becoming something, just so we have a base that I can work from. But in the past 2 weeks I actually managed to get my work in progress state to something that runs again, and that actually will act as a cleaner base, hopefully, to work on top than an older version of the code. Let me know, for example, here if this is kind of readable in my code editor. And what I would suggest to do is that we first kind of collect our thoughts and create like a to-do list or kind of a strategy for how we want to tackle this quite large topic of, well, epidemics, but more importantly, pedestrians and how they interact. So I think this will definitely give us material for quite a lot of live streams. I will have to see how exactly I can organize them and integrate them into my life, but I would love for this to be a longer series, and we can kind of start small or immediately dive into the complicated topics. So I would suggest that we first do a bit of mindstorming regarding what are all the things that we can and want to do, that we need to do, and in which order do we want to tackle them. So I would suggest that for that I will create, just in the Citybound Living Design doc, kind of a new page here. I will put the link to it in the chat in a second, so you can follow along even if you maybe miss a part of the stream. So let's call this the Pedestrians and Epidemics live streams. So this should be public, so I copy the page link, which should allow you to see this page as well. And then I'll just try to line out here what we want to do. So in general, we want to implement pedestrians in Citybound. Kind of independently from that, we want to implement viruses and their spread. And now let's see which more detailed points both of these topics entail and kind of how they are related and can be connected. So let's think about the first one, just because I guess all of you have it on the top of your mind and are thinking about it on a daily basis. So the most important question is really where do people interact, where the virus could spread. So there's kind of two categories in which I want to think about this, because of how things are implemented in Citybound. Of course, the real answer to this question is kind of everywhere, but let's divide it into work, shops, other places, which I would call kind of buildings other than home, and then kind of outside on the street. So, well, streets, plazas, parks, and so on. Because you mentioned schools, I would put that here as well. And if you think about it, the home is also really just a building where people stay together. So we can really generalize this as buildings where people stay together. And we just start with home. Let's add these as examples here. So let's kind of see which of those we already have implemented in Citybound. So we definitely have homes. We have workplaces for people. We do have shops. We don't have schools yet. But since they will work pretty similarly and we don't even have the concept of children in Citybound, we will kind of ignore them for now. But once we have the others working, it should be easy to add schools later and have them behave in the same way with regards to viruses. Because, again, keep in mind, we really only care about these being buildings where people stay together, and they in fact already work similarly in Citybound. And of course hospitals, which is like a bit of a special thing because these heal people. So pubs and shopping malls I would just consider parts of shops. I'm actually liking the delay I have on the chat. It seems like we can kind of have a conversation like that. So just for completeness sake, I'll kind of add them here. So public transport for me would fall into this category here. So street, public transport. So I would call this whole category kind of on the way. People in Citybound are either like at a place or they're on the way to somewhere else. And these are the two things we have to consider. Here we can again just keep track of what we already have. So we do have streets, where that has kind of two subcategories of cars and pedestrians. And we have public transport. So already kind of talking about how we might implement this, since I mentioned earlier the whole implement pedestrians thing is quite a huge topic in itself. What we could maybe first do is kind of implement epidemics based on just what we have. So kind of first approximation is model spread at buildings, and then it's kind of silly, but just so we have something kind of like we want to go for at the end, we could model spread between cars that are close to each other. This is obviously just a placeholder for pedestrians as soon as they work, at which point we would probably remove the spread between cars, because I don't think that that really happens unless everyone has like a convertible. yeah, Jesse's already asking about pedestrian. Let's look at that in a second. But this is, for example, something that I think we could start with right today in the stream. Because we don't need pedestrians at all yet, and it helps us think about how we will implement the virus in general, even if we do it more reasonably with pedestrians later on. So let's think though what is really needed to implement pedestrians. So we need to be able to build the transport infrastructure for pedestrians, which is basically sidewalks. Let's do sidewalks, and then let's do later on plazas and parks, just so we have some kind of two-dimensional areas for people to move in. And the reason why I separate those is because, kind of related to what Jesse is saying, sidewalks we'll be able to do pretty similarly to lanes on a road, whereas plazas and parks, with people being able to freely move in a kind of 2D area, we will need to implement it quite a bit differently. So I would kind of do this first and think about this later. What else do we need to do? Pedestrians need to be able to do pathfinding on that infrastructure. And this will probably work very similarly to how cars work right now. And I hope that we will be able to reuse quite a lot of the code for that. Finally, pedestrians need to be able to individually walk on a sidewalk and interact in some way or another. So this is what I would, for cars, call microtraffic, which really considers all the different cars that are on one stretch of road and and how they interact with each other, how they have to take cars on neighboring or conflicting lanes into account. And we need something kind of similar for pedestrians. So for pedestrians, this is what I would call crowd simulation. That's kind of the field for that, and it's a whole topic for itself. But again, here we will need to distinguish between 1D-ish sidewalks, where roughly everyone is going either one way or the other, but mainly along an axis. So you have the main axis, but then people can also avoid each other kind of by going sideways. And like Marco mentions, as a first approximation, which might work and look quite well for a long time, we can just let pedestrians pass through each other, and then maybe with some basic avoidance, but where it's not bad that if they run into each other, like with cars, where it's actually considered, well, an accident that the car runs into another one. In this case, we just can imagine that they almost hit each other, because in any case, what we really care about, at least for the virus, is rough proximity. So we don't really care if they actually bump into each other or not, or it doesn't really make much of a difference. Yeah, Jesse mentions that you really have to think about crowds more like a fluid, which can actually get congested. So that's something that we might be able to let me just write that down. Let's call it like fluid dynamics. So what's important is that if you have a lot of people in one particular place, they slow down. I think that's the simplest we can make crowd simulation while getting some realistic effects. Then, like I said earlier, you have kind of 2D areas where people have a lot more ways to avoid each other. And I'm not quite sure how we want to model those. We kind of have two approaches. Either we model them as a bunch of 1D paths which kind of cross all over the 2D space, like a nav mesh in game engines, if you know that, or really something completely different, or in the end we decide that 1D sidewalk is actually just a narrow 2D path itself. These are all kind of things that we might want to explore over time, but for now I think it's good if we go for this, that we just model 1D sidewalks where people can pass through each other, but if they get close to each other they slow down, so we get the kind of simple congestion, and we already need to check if people are close to each other, which we can then reuse for virus spread. There's one more kind of interesting thing to consider, which is crossings or even jaywalking, where sidewalks, or what I would call virtual jaywalk sidewalks, interact with car traffic. So what I mean by that is that obviously we will need to consider how at a normal crossing or at a normal intersection cars and pedestrians are in conflict with each other and they will both try to avoid each other. And then the way you could implement jaywalking in a simple way is that you kind of just randomly generate along a road kind of hidden paths where people might decide to go to cross the road, which is really just like a hidden crossing, which might have some like higher pathfinding costs associated with it than the actual distance across the road that it is to simulate people only doing that if it really gives them an advantage. But we can come back to that. That's kind of like a whole little topic in itself. Yeah, that would be cool if we get into this polite no after you loop. I guess what can really help us there is the whole like topic of Boyd simulation, which you use to simulate flocks of birds in video games, which really have very simple rules but create quite complicated crowd behavior. And Hugism is asking if I would already consider citizens choosing whether they walk or drive for particular journeys. So that's kind of part of pathfinding. Which is a whole interesting topic in itself, because obviously once we add public transport to the mix later, we have this issue of needing to compare kind of very different modes of transport that have very different characteristics and finding a good solution there for each citizen. So first we might just randomly decide, which would probably be a bit stupid. Second, we could just use distance, because we should be able to get a somewhat accurate distance measure for each of them, or like rather estimated time to destination. And later we can do more complicated comparisons, for example, like how beautiful is the footpath, and so on. All kinds of considerations that go into walking versus driving in real life. So Dustin is asking, do I have activity modeling for people? How do people choose where to go, what time to leave? Yes, for now just let me say that we already do have activity modeling. It's basically it basically depends on which resources a household has and which resources it currently deems most urgently in need of fixing or like fulfilling. And based on that, they go to places that can fulfill these needs. Like if a household runs out of money, they will go to work. If they run out of food, they will go buy groceries. And it's kind of manipulated to give different kind of importance multipliers on different times of the day. So without that, people kind of do fulfill their needs, but they end up with very unrealistic daily schedules, kind of ignoring the fact that we have cultural norms and habits of going to work at certain times and so on. So there's these kind of multipliers on top which just make people really care about money in the morning, which makes them go to work, which is a bit silly, but again, it's a simplified representation of the cultural norms that we have. That's roughly a very short summary of how activity works in Citybound. Yeah, that's a good idea that the jaywalking hidden crosswalks could change their cost based on how many cars there are. Okay, so I think we have quite a good overview for the beginning. Let's see if we are missing anything. Not that I really know of. So, okay, we didn't actually talk about how we can model the virus spreading, which will kind of tie the two together and also go a bit more into the activity modeling. So how to really model the virus. And yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Again, thinking about how I just described activities, the core idea of the Citybound simulation is really that everything that should matter to the citizens is modeled as a resource which they can either get or lose. That includes things that obviously are resources, like I mentioned, like money or food, but it can also include some intangible things like hunger, psychological states. You can kind of think of the Sims bars showing different physical or psychological needs that people have, or even something like education or even specialized education. These are all resources in Citybound, and resources can either be associated with a whole household, like a whole family. For example, each family in Citybound actually shares money and goods like groceries, or associated with an actual individual member of that family. So the way I would model the virus thus is exactly as a resource that people have. So let me just put this down here. That's kind of the Citybound philosophy. So something that kind of, like, it doesn't exist in Citybound yet, something related exists where there is kind of wakefulness, which is the opposite of being tired, which currently in Citybound makes people go to sleep at night and kind of use their wakefulness during the day when they're working. So one obvious very important thing for the virus there would be a resource which we would just call health. And then we could actually model having the virus or not, or even being infected to varying degrees by making a resource for the virus. So let's call it a resource infection with virus. And answering Tom Fu's question, if we're talking about one dangerous virus or just a common flu, it could really be either, and we could even have one resource per illness or per germ. But for the beginning, obviously, we will pretend that there is just really one virus, which people can either have or not. Sultan is asking, how about negative resources like smoke, noise, litter? Basically, the way I decided to do it in Citybound, just for clarity, is that I formulate everything as positive things that you would want to have, like wakefulness, health. So you could imagine smoke, noise, litter negatively impacting health, and you could imagine having different subcategories of health, like psychological health, even different kinds of bodily health, and so on. So finally, to tie this all together and to show how that would influence activities, because the goal of having these resources obviously is not just to be able to track things and to have resources, but the goal of resources is cause realistic behavior, even in a very chaotic setting, with everything interacting. So like I said, it works okay so far for the resources that I have. We might actually still need some tuning. That's something that I kind of neglected for a long time. People tend to get way too tired and then never catch up with sleeping, because I probably have some wrong factors here and there. So as we will implement the virus, we might actually want to tweak the just normal resources and behaviors of citizens, so we have a bit more of a realistic base to build on top of. But the question is, how do you really model realistic behavior with resources? I hinted at one thing earlier, which is kind of the simplest thing, like if low on some resource, go somewhere you can get it. So if you're low on groceries, you want to go to a supermarket, for example, grocery shop, and you actually look at all the different grocery shops in the city or in your vicinity and choose the one that is easiest to get to and that has the best prices kind of weighed by each other. That's roughly what the citizens are doing right now. So, but what about more complicated things, or things where you might need to trade off one thing for another? And for that I have something which I kind of think about as chemical reactions between resources, where like certain places can convert one resource into another. Let me actually make this a numbered list, because it's like the 3 separate ways in which resources cause behavior. So an example for that is actually if people go to work, they literally convert wakefulness into money, or any kind of industry that creates higher complexity products out of lower complexity ones. Like so far, for example, a bakery exists and it takes grain and milk and it converts it into bread, I think. That's modeled as a chemical reaction where, like, if there are some workers present, over time a certain amount of the input resources will get converted into output resources. And that's how businesses are modeled, or how industry is modeled. Another example is, for example, that a supermarket takes bread and a lot of other stuff like meat and converts it into groceries, whereby we kind of approximate people wanting a whole category of things, in this case groceries, and we want the interesting supply chains of different categories, like subcategories that go into that. So by also modeling that as a chemical reaction where supermarkets take bread and take meat and convert it into groceries, and then people only care about groceries, so that's kind of easy to model, but we still have a realistic supply chain of all the different, well, things that can be groceries. Like Zoltan mentions, you can actually model the desire for entertainment the same way. So if you're lacking entertainment, the citizen might actually decide to go to the cinema, for example. The node app I'm using is Notion for interest. So let me just read through the chat a bit here to make sure I didn't miss anything. So Jesse is already thinking in detail about how we can set thresholds and when someone is really considered ill. So now let me finish the ways in which resources cause behavior in Citybound, and then we can already start thinking about how we could apply that to the virus. So the third thing that's happening is that there's just kind of a natural depletion or growth of some resources at a place. Which sometimes happen as part of an activity. So if people are at home and sleeping, they are getting sleep, whereas during the whole day they are losing wakefulness. A crop field is over time just continuously growing crops. Like that's how simply it is modeled right now. Obviously later on this itself could have input resources that get converted, actually like fertilizer or seeds or whatever have you, but for now we just consider a crop field something that generates crops out of nowhere. So taken together, these are like the ways in which resources and people interact and how they cause certain behaviors. Maybe the one thing that's a bit missing here is that people prioritize resource needs, and this determines their daily activities. So I hope that this kind of ties together the whole picture of how resources work and how they can help us. Jesse's mentioning an interesting point that the way we will be modeling the virus can actually be applied to a lot of other things that are kind of viral or sticky, where people or places just have some intangible resources that they carry around and kind of influence everyone that comes into contact with them, like for example the feeling of a neighborhood or advertising. So that already brings us to how we can apply that to virus spread, or like how to implement virus spread using that. So what I would suggest is that kind of as a source, people have a very low probability of randomly getting the virus just out of nowhere. Obviously representing more complicated real life things like the virus being introduced from another country or even appearing for the first time ever. Then I would suggest that we first have one simple resource which models both severity and infectiousness. At the same time. Obviously in real life, and especially with the coronavirus, we see that these can be independent, where you can not have symptoms for quite a long time and where the severity of symptoms varies quite dramatically between people. But in our case, let's just have a simple model where you can either not be really ill or not ill at all, or you are very ill and then you're also very infectious. And I mean, we can still later think about different flavors of viruses and how we would model those. So regarding spread, it's quite obvious that there should be a random chance to give some of your infection to people close by. And thinking again about our categories from up here, that's really like at buildings or on the way. So in both cases, we need to have some model of proximity. And I can tell you that for buildings, that model already exists. I will have to check if that's also the case for families, but at least for businesses, I think I have a representation of who's currently at the building together, and we still need to implement that for on the way, so for on the street. So like that, we should be able to simulate spread quite naturally and already quite realistically. Finally, we want to model the influence on activities, and in a more extreme sense, even the destiny of a citizen. So the question is, what is the behavior that we want to see? Ideally, if someone gets very sick, it basically becomes their number one priority. They stay at home and all they do is to try to treat the illness by sleeping, let's say. So kind of starting at medium severity, illness is the top priority, and you can try to heal it, which really just means resource exchange by sleeping. So the way we could do that is to just have the sleeping ability not only make you more awake, but also slightly make you more healthy if you have a virus. So it would kind of make that better. And we need to be precise here. Maybe a separate health resource makes sense, and then the like infection severity depletes that over time. Let me know, by the way, if it's okay for you to listen to me kind of typing and talking at the same way, because I know that I make kind of awkward breaks in between and it might be a bit hard to listen to. I'm happy to switch to first saying something and then writing it down, or writing down less. So that, let me just know how that sounds for you. And let me take the opportunity to catch up with chat. Yeah, obviously there's a million variables that can be introduced to the simulation, like a person being more healthy in the beginning or having a different kind of natural resistance to the virus, people becoming immune after having the virus. But I think for the beginning, let's just keep it really simple. Don't think about proximity too hard in the building sense, at least. Obviously we're not modeling interiors, so we just consider everyone in a building to kind of be in the same place for now. it could also be a resource that people leave behind at the building or the road, but then, like, at this point we would be modeling a virus that really sticks to surfaces, for example, and I think it's already enough if we first model a virus that only gets transmitted through kind of direct contact, kind of like coronavirus. So someone mentioned hospitals earlier, where this is kind of what the behaviors that we want to see at high severity, where like just staying at home, doing nothing else and sleeping isn't enough, but they should somehow realize that only the kind of hospital place can provide enough health resource to fix the situation. And even then, if it's too far progressed, the infection severity might deplete health quicker than the hospital can, and at this point I guess we can model citizens dying. But for now I think this is a pretty good rough sketch of how we can tackle it. Let me know if that makes sense. Since we just had someone joining, hi Adam, I will share again the link to our notes so you can kind of catch up at least roughly with what we were discussing so far. And I think I will take a short break then, just like 5 minutes, and when I'm back we can think about what we want to start with implementing actually. And of course, if you have any other thoughts about this in the meantime, let me know. Yeah, I mean, then there's the whole topic of counteractions and how you can react to that, at which point we really get into it being a catastrophe like in SimCity, and you being able to in real time enact certain things or even build infrastructure. But for now, let's just... Yeah, that's great, thank you. For now, let's just kind of let it happen. And it would be cool to even first have hospitals in the city. Like, we could even have them first without ambulances, where people themselves drive there, which doesn't really make sense if the person is driving themselves, but again, it's full of first approximations, and then we go from there. Okay, so I'll be back in 5 minutes. I'll let you guys know in chat. And let's think about what we want to start with then. Okay, I'm back. Let me know if you can hear me and see everything again. And let me just go through the chat and everything that you mentioned during the break. So I'd also like to know, Jesse, what you meant by passive acquisition. And yeah, I agree with Marco that thresholds are probably a good way to trigger those different cases of people reacting to a disease. And again, obviously, once we have health, we can have it be influenced by a lot of other things, like all the things you guys mentioned here. So 239, the reason why I don't want to just model everything as 2D pathfinding is because it would kind of become really intractable at the scale of a city and the number of pedestrians that I would have. That's in fact already why I modeled cars as more of a 1D thing. And like I said earlier, it's probably worth it to have a more complicated model for actual 2D areas like plazas or parks. I think to have believable shortcuts, we could have a lot of hidden paths that would make the behavior more interesting and people kind of making up paths as they go. Yes, I'm always keeping in mind desire paths because I really like this kind of emergent behavior. So one way to do that would be just if people realize that the footpath to somewhere along official paths is way longer than the distance, the direct distance in space, they could kind of construct random paths as shortcuts where there's no obstacles, which internally are represented as if they were official paths, but you in the beginning can't even see them on the map, and then if people take them continuously, you might see trails forming there. Yeah, I see. We definitely need that you just constantly deplete a resource. I mean, if you think about the really long term, I want to have even a somewhat 2D model of traffic where people don't just strictly follow lanes, but you have kind of more flexible or chaotic behavior, like you might actually know from GTA, which implements this quite well. Obviously, GTA despawns cars that are even still quite close to you, so they keep the number of cars with this quite complex behavior under control, but I don't really see why that shouldn't, at least in principle, be possible for a whole city, but it will certainly be pretty damn difficult to optimize, and I would have to rely on lots of optimizations from fluid simulation to kind of figure out which cars are close to each other and should react to each other. And for now, the 1D model is a lot simpler, both conceptually as well, to get running fast. So thanks for all your ideas. I mean, obviously, I already gave you quite a lot of my ideas and plans here, and I kind of have two options of what to start with, but let me know maybe what you would be more interested in, starting with the simple model of spreading the virus through buildings and, for the beginning, cars, or implementing pedestrians, kind of starting that whole topic. And I'll just kind of take a visual vote of what you people think and think about it some more myself, and then we'll go ahead and start with that. I'll give you guys a bit more time to decide, but so far it seems like people really want to see pedestrians first. So maybe already the disclaimer there. I think I'm also slightly biased towards doing that just because it would be really cool to have pedestrians, but it's a huge topic and we will probably not get a lot done today yet, but then again I think that's okay. If we just start somewhere and then I have some homework to do and we can continue in the next live stream. Alright, cool. Well, that seems pretty anonymous. Is that how you say that? I don't know. So let's go through our list. We want to implement pedestrians. What does that mean? And I think we really need to start with this. We need to be able to build transport infrastructure, and I would start with sidewalks. I mentioned earlier that sidewalks work very similarly to road lanes, and I would actually suggest that we implement them as just that they're a type of lane that can be added to a road, and just by doing it like that you already get a couple nice things. So let's keep our notes here. They will be just a type of lane that can be added to a road, which gives us normal sidewalks on the sides. Using that you could also have median sidewalks in the center of a road, and you could have pure footpaths by just basically creating a road that only contains sidewalk lanes. So our course of action here will be first to look at how lanes are currently implemented and the UI for changing them, which I think we need to fix because it's still broken right now, but that should be a quick fix. And that will already warm us up for how we can build those. And how we can create the UI for that. Let me see what you guys are saying. Wouldn't it be hard to expand one lane sidewalks to get wider ones? What I would suggest there is that we start first with actually sidewalks as discrete lanes that only exist in kind of one width. And then maybe later we can go to actually variable widths for the sidewalk lanes. And Jesse is right that kind of having a lot of parallel pedestrian lanes is a good middle ground for something like plazas, where that's kind of what I meant earlier, that you have enough mesh, but not as strictly as you see in some games where then people only follow the kind of hidden paths on that 2D area, but with already more complicated lane interaction, like merging between lanes or avoiding people on conflicting lanes, which would pretty much give you 2D crowd behavior if you have a bunch of these more complex overlapping 1D paths. But for now, let's just start with the lanes and let's dive into the code. So the code structure probably changed quite a bit since I did my last live stream. So let me just give a very brief overview. As you might remember, Citybound, at least most of the simulation, is now implemented in Rust, actually all of the simulation. And then the UI, the game UI that you play with, is a browser app that's mostly written in JavaScript, but that has kind of a Rust bridge to the simulation that communicates with the simulation server, which is then compiled to WebAssembly and interacts with the JavaScript in the client to, well, render the UI together with the JavaScript basically. I now had the chance to, in preparation for these live streams, review a lot of code of the simulation that I didn't touch in a long time, and it's kind of crazy because it's code that was written over quite a large spread of time, and like some of it is really clean and neat, some of it not so much, and it's quite crazy. And I actually spent some time cleaning up now for the stream for the areas that I thought we will touch. And the main thing is that it's roughly divided into topics, and I pulled out a couple specialized libraries, like how time passes or how planning mode is implemented. But most of what we really care about here is in the Citybound simulation folder, and here you can kind of see all the different topics that exist. So you have the economy simulation, environment, which so far really is just trees, land use, which incorporates both zoning as well as built, like constructed buildings. You have planning in general, which includes all of planning of both transport, so road, as well as, well, the land use has its own zone planning subtopic, and transport has its own transport planning subtopic. Time is actually empty because I moved that somewhere else, so we can delete that folder. And transport again involves several subtopics, so construction of roads, how lanes work or how they're represented in general, microtraffic, what I mentioned earlier, how cars on one lane interact with each other, pathfinding, which is obviously really important, well, the whole transport planning, and some things called UI that help the browser UI render roads. So I think it helps if we really look at the definition of what a lane is, and go from there. So I would suggest that we just go through everything that the lane is. A lane is uniquely identified by an ID. It has a construction info, which really just represents the lane being built or destructed. That is something that used to be animated. For now, for simplicity, I disabled that, so a lane just appears immediately. But it keeps track of some things like for which plan change is this lane being destructed, for which other lanes is it still connected to that we need to take care of. It's not really that important for everything going on during most of the simulation. Connectivity is interesting because that really, well, defines how a lane interacts with other lanes. And at this point I should probably explain some slightly counterintuitive things about lanes and Citybound, where, let me actually start up the game for that. And you will need to let me know how well that runs with the stream. Actually, I probably still have a save game, so let's remove that. And just really start from a clean slate. And let's open up the game UI in Chrome. Here we have an empty map. And let me know if that looks like it runs smoothly when I rotate the camera, and if the screen hopefully doesn't suffer. So let's just build a very simple road and implement that plan. And now I can really explain what I mean with lanes. So obviously, like, these are all 2-lane roads, one for each direction. So I don't know how well you can see my cursor, but this here is a lane and the opposite side is also a lane. But then where it gets counterintuitive is that on an intersection like this, you also have a bunch of lanes where like every possible connection between any of the incoming roads that cars might go on is considered a lane. With the special thing being that parallel lanes in the same direction you can merge between, so that's one kind of interaction, and lanes on an intersection might conflict with each other, and cars there should avoid other cars even though they're not on the same lane. Let me know if that makes sense so far. So this is what you need to keep in mind with this connectivity info. Let's look at that. So each lane has actually a vector, so like a list of interactions with other lanes, and it also knows whether it's a lane on an intersection or on a road. So this is quite self-explanatory. Let's look at what an interaction looks like. So you can see this is a Rust enum, which kind of represents different possible alternatives of what an interaction of two lanes could be, or of one lane with another. So this interaction previous means that the lane has a previous lane. So I don't really know how to explain that, but probably here. Imagine the lane that connects these two is on the intersection, and it has a next lane, which is this one that goes to the right here. So this lane and the previous one on the intersection have a previous next relationship, and this is encoded by these two, where like we know the ID of our previous lane, and for kind of mapping obstacles we need to know how long the previous lane is. I will explain that in a second. Same, we have an interaction that represents the next lane, the following lane that we will go, or one of the possible following next lanes that we can go onto. So again, if you look at this lane coming from the bottom here, it actually has several next lanes that it can go to, either the one turning right, the one going straight, or the one turning left. So it would have a next interaction with each of these, and you see here that it has a Boolean field called green, which is used to represent traffic lights. So over time this green property changes, which means that you are allowed to enter this next lane or not, which again influences the microtraffic behavior. Let me just check chat so to make sure you're all following along. Yeah, in general, I of course want to have like an intersection editing UI where you can manually add or remove the intersection lanes. Yeah, you're saying the same. I'm not explicitly naming them outlets and inlets because it might not necessarily be about intersections. Like a road might also, in a sense, end and be directly connected to another road, where it's not really an outlet or inlet. They actually are just previous and next lanes. So the next two types of interactions are a bit more interesting. Here we have the conflicting interaction, which would be, for example, on this intersection, the one that goes straight like this, and the one that goes straight in the other direction. Let me see if I reload here, if I can get a more normal cursor that you can see better. Can you even see my cursor? I certainly hope so. So if we take this lane going straight across and this lane going straight across, these two are conflicting lanes. So how can they conflict? First we need to of course know which the conflicting lane is, and now it would be good to draw something. Kind of didn't manage to hook up my iPad yet. So how do we want to do that? Let's take a screenshot of this, and I will just mark that up with my mouse. So I hope you can see the screenshot here, and I will just draw directly on here. So we have one lane like this. No, please don't do that. One lane like this, and they have an area in which they intersect, which is kind of defined by the start and the end of the intersection area in one-dimensional terms. So this is what these, can I move that? Yeah. This is what this start and end and conflicting start and conflicting end attributes mean here, that in a 1D sense, along this lane, for example, where does the conflict zone start and end? And correspondingly on the conflicting lane, where does it start and end? And like that, we know when a car on the other lane represents an obstacle and how exactly it should be mapped. So I hope that makes sense. I will close that. And if I create one more intersection that has kind of a much flatter angle, let me implement that. Take a screenshot and annotate that again. So here, if we consider this lane here and this lane, you see that first the area in which they conflict is quite a lot longer, and that if a car is like on this lane, it's actually almost like an obstacle going in front of us. So it's not just our lane is blocked or not, but you might imagine actually kind of merging around it. So all the information we need to do this mapping of obstacles, which is actually one of the main things that the whole microtraffic module does, is using these numbers here to geometrically map conflicting lanes to each other. And we have this parameter here called can_weave, where basically if the conflicting lanes are at roughly a right angle, you consider them just completely blocked if there's a car on the conflicting lane. Whereas if they can weave, if they have this really shallow angle, the cars actually behave more as if they were driving behind each other. Does that make sense? Finally, we have something called a switch interaction, where if we have several lanes that we can merge between or switch between, how it's called in the code here, there's actually a virtual lane between each two lanes that you can merge between, which is considered you being on both of the corresponding lanes. Now would be a good time to actually draw some roads with more lanes, but like I said, it's a bit broken, so let me maybe just change the default for how many lanes roads have very quickly. So you see, by the way, here, if we go into the whole Citybound browser UI project, that there's corresponding topics for the simulation topics responsible for just drawing that stuff and creating the UI for that. So let's see here in transport planning, give me a second to find that. I think it's implemented like if we switch to road planning, then we set our drawing intent to draw a road, and we can see here that this has two parameters for how many lanes you want. So let's just quickly change the defaults, which are stupidly hard-coded in here, and rebuild the UI. Let me read chat in the meantime. Yeah, these interactions could be more parametric, but they don't really have a lot in common. They are really more like alternatives that work very differently from each other. Okay, so let's see if I reload the browser UI now. When I draw a road, it should by default now create a 4-lane road. Perfect. because then I can explain what I wanted to explain about the switching lanes. Let's build that. So here we have some lanes that you can obviously merge between. So these are represented as two normal lanes, like this one and this one. And in between them, let me draw that with a different color, you have what is called, no, not this one, I want you to be red. In between them you have like a virtual switching lane, where if a car wants to merge between the two red lines, it first goes onto this virtual switching lane, at which point it's really considered an obstacle both for the left and the right lane, and it's like animating its progress of switching. It might, while it's on there, even decide to give up on the lane merge. For example, if it suddenly sees that there's actually a car approaching quite quickly from behind. And once it's completed the merging, it gets put onto the left lane completely and is not considered to be in conflict with the right lane anymore. Let me know if that makes sense. It's a bit weird way to represent that, but it really resulted in the cleanest code, so that's how it works in Citybound. Let me know if that made sense. If it did, that means that we now understood all the different ways that lanes can interact and are thus connected. So coming back to pedestrians, we can imagine that we actually just implement them very much the same way, that a pedestrian lane can have previous and next lanes, it can have conflicting pedestrian lanes, although they might be a lot easier because in the beginning we might want to let people pass through each other. But latest, when we want to have some kind of congestion, we should do a very similar kind of mapping of people on one lane being mapped onto a conflicting lane and acting as obstacles there as well. So probably this will work just exactly the same, and then we can obviously also have conflicts between a pedestrian lane and a car lane, where a pedestrian standing on the road will be an obstacle for a car, just like a car standing on a conflicting lane. And that should hopefully just work if we implement them like that. So let's go back to the definition of the lane itself. We looked at what's in connectivity here. In microtraffic, we really store the whole state of the cars on the road, or in the case of our pedestrians, where the pedestrians are. Let's look at that next. So the microtraffic state of a lane contains a bunch of obstacles, which I consider basically everything that is somehow relevant for this lane that's not directly on the lane itself. So for cars, so far obstacles can be cars on other interacting lanes. And how is an obstacle defined? We can see here that it has a position, which is a one-dimensional position along the lane. It has a velocity and a max velocity, both also expressed as just one-dimensional velocities along the lane axis. And for each obstacle, we kind of remember which lane it came from originally. Then, of course, we have our cars, where the interesting thing is that a car actually is also just an obstacle with some extra information added to it. So a car also has the like 1D position and velocity, but in addition to that, it has an acceleration. It is associated with a trip. It has a pathfinding destination, and this next hop interaction basically represents the next turn that the car will take, because again, if we look here, one lane actually has several next lanes to go to, and depending on pathfinding, the car needs to pick one of the next lanes. And well, let's just look at this. This basically encodes the index of the interaction that we will take to the next, that will take us to the next lane on the way to our destination. Does that make sense so far? Because then I would suggest we, as the last kind of preparation thing, look at how the microtraffic actual simulation update is implemented, and then we can start by implementing different lane times. All right, thank you so much for sticking with us, Jesse. Have a good night and see you next time, hopefully, and stay healthy. So let's just look at the tick function here for a lane, where first we don't do traffic on every tick, because, or at least we don't do cars reacting to each other on every tick, but so people don't have to rethink whether they should be accelerating or braking kind of every microsecond, but rather just in larger ticks. We see here that lanes themselves, if they're on an intersection, actually change from being green to red. We saw that in the interaction earlier, but the lane itself on an intersection can actually be green or red based on time, where like somehow during planning traffic light timing was determined, and here we just see based on the timing what should our current state be. If our green status changes, we actually inform connected lanes about that, so that the cars can stop on the lane leading into the intersection before entering it. Okay, if we do want to calculate the traffic, what we do here is we basically take together all the cars and obstacles on a lane and sort them by the 1D position, so how far they progressed along the lane, and then go through them one by one, because if you think about it, each car really only needs to think about the car in front of it, not about any of the other ones. And if you generalize that to cars or obstacles, because you might have an obstacle from a conflicting lane that's actually closer to you than the next car that's actually on your lane, if there even is one. So we just kind of merge both of them together and then have each car only react to the very next car. And yes, I mentioned it earlier very quickly, that vehicles take obstacles on either of the lanes, both where they're coming from and where they're merging to, into account. And they might give up on the merge based on them. So basically here we just use some logic for each car to figure out what is the next obstacle, either car on my lane or on another lane. What is the, do we know the acceleration of the obstacle if it has one, and then we apply what is called an intelligent acceleration based on, well, our current state, so how fast are we going right now, how fast are we accelerating, and the obstacle in front of us. And this implements something called an intelligent driver model, which is just a simple formula for how cars behave compared to the cars in front of them, which a lot of traffic simulation papers use. It has a bunch of parameters, which you can see here, like what is the car length, like what is the maximum comfortable braking, and based on all of that you basically calculate whether you should accelerate or brake, and that's what each car does every time the traffic, the micro traffic logic is updated. So like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't happen all the time, just in like short intervals, but what does happen all the time is actually kind of the physics simulation, which basically just very simply moves the car forward based on its velocity and how much time passed, and changes the velocity based on the acceleration. This is very standard stuff. And here we actually move forward the predicted position of obstacles, because we might not always have up-to-date information from obstacles, so in between we kind of just predict where they might be going. Finally, here, if a car reaches the end of a lane, we actually no, sorry, this is something else. Let's just make sure that cars don't pass through each other. So here what happens in the end of the tick function is that we basically look at all cars and see if either they reach their destination on our lane, like for example if there's a building right next to it and that's where they want to go, well then they just disappear. Or if they reach the end of the lane and should be transferred to the next lane, at which point we basically again map the position on our lane to the next lane that they're going onto, and we use the pathfinding logic to then find out their next turn and where they should go. Just kind of summarizing a lot of pretty complicated code here at once. Let me know if you're still following and if that all makes sense. This is probably the most complete description of Citybound microtraffic that I've ever given, but I think it's good to have all of that in mind for pedestrians. And I would suggest to take another small break of 5 minutes, give you some time to chew on everything I just said, and then maybe we do one more 45-ish minute session of adding a new lane type and just seeing how that works out. What do you think? And yeah, just let me know your thoughts in the chat. I'll read them when I come back in 5 minutes. Okay, and I'm back. And I hope you can hear and see everything again. So, enigmatic effigy is of course right that I should put everything I just told you into the code. I'm still not quite sure how I want to go about that. I would love to have some kind of mixed document / code thing where I can have something like this, but also like where I can have a longer explanation plus maybe even some drawings right next to the relevant code. So I'll just wait for a second until everyone is back. If you're back, just please write in the chat so I get a rough estimate of if people are back. And because there's one more core concept which I really need to need you to understand before we add new lane types. Okay, seems like people are back. So, in all of my description, you probably noticed that lanes are aware of other lanes that they interact with, and we looked at the different kinds of intersections like previous or next lanes, lanes being connected by these hidden switching lanes or lanes conflicting on an intersection. But they don't really have any notion of being part of a road or even being part of an intersection. Like, lanes are just completely unaware of that. They just consider themselves as part of this, well, network of lanes. Oops. So the question is, where do roads really come in, and like where do we have the notion of adding or removing lanes from a road? And yeah, how is that represented? So the important concept there is that roads only exist in planning mode, and a plan has a notion of a road. So if I draw a new road here as a new plan, this is actually represented as like just this line connecting these 2 points, and this is called a gesture in Citybound. So in planning modes, what you as the player are drawing is actually gestures, and they can be more complicated paths like this one. Here you have a gesture connecting these 4 points, and then the gesture is associated with an intent. And an intent could either be a road intent, which for now just specifies how many lanes there are on either side of the road. But in a similar way, if I draw a zone, that's actually also just a gesture, in this case connecting these points to an area with a different intent. In this case, the intent is a zoning intent, with the zone being set to residential. So this is really how planning mode works. It just considers a bunch of gestures which typically have paths, and then the intent really defines what it is about. You can see that the intersections here are really just a byproduct of 2 road gestures interacting, and again, in the end, the lanes have no idea why they're on an intersection or which other lanes are part of the intersection. They only know the minimal information necessary to route cars and have them avoid each other. But during the plan is exactly when we take our gestures together with our intents and we convert them into prototypes that specify exactly this is a road piece, like from here to here, then there's an intersection. On this road piece, 4 lanes should be built exactly from here to here. They should interact in this way. On this intersection, there will be those lanes. This all happens during the planning step. So the first thing that we need to do if we want to introduce sidewalks is to have them represented in planning mode. So I would suggest that we go ahead and do that. And for that, we close the game and we actually stop it to kind of save computer resources. Let's delete the save game so we can start fresh. Oh, that actually crashed it, of course. And we will look at planning mode and how roads are represented there. Close that. Just reading through the thoughts here. There are no sidewalks yet. Yes, I mentioned that earlier when we talked about deciding about driving versus walking. And like you said, we need more complicated comparisons, or we need to add costs to driving, otherwise driving will always be faster. Well, for example, something very obvious and realistic would be to add a getting in and out of the car cost to driving, where even though something might be 2 minutes away by car, the time it gets you to even get in the car is longer than it would take you to get there by foot. Plus then all kinds of other considerations that you can model later, basically, like you said, as additional costs. Hi there, Alex. Nice to have you joining. And cool to have you as a follower, just like everyone else, of course. So let's look at the planning mode and what we have so far. I mentioned, I just explained gestures and intents. And we actually have a bunch more where, like, the trees in Citybound are actually also planned, because in a way everything that exists in the Citybound world has to be constructed by a plan, and even though the player doesn't influence all of them manually, they still are part of a plan. So even the trees which you see in the beginning are part of one city plan for the city, and if you build roads over a tree, that really just changes the plan for this tree, removing it in the plan, which then when you construct the plan removes the actual living tree in the world. So that's kind of how these things work. And I mentioned that gestures together with intents get converted into prototypes, and the prototypes really specify like the atomic pieces of what needs to be constructed. So in the case of a road, it specifies which lanes need to be constructed. And you can see that, let's just go through it so we understand exactly what is going on. So this is really just the top level definitions for planning. And I showed earlier that, for example, transport has its whole own transport planning section. So let's look at that. We can see here that both the road intent as well as the road prototypes are defined somewhere else. So let's have a look at that. So let's look at a road intent, which is what we are drawing into the plan. As I mentioned, we have a path, which is just, it has a complicated name, but it's really just a path smoothly connecting these points. And it has a lane configuration, which so far is very simple. It just has n lanes forward and lanes backward. So this here will be our very point where we will start implementing pedestrian sidewalks, because so far we don't even distinguish between different types of lanes. We will need to distinguish, so we will need to change our representation here. A general comment at this point is that one of the things I really like about Rust, obviously, is that it's strictly typed. So whenever we want to introduce a change to the code, we can kind of just pick one of the places that will be affected and sketch out, write down how that should look there, and then just through the type checking see the ripple effects through the whole code base, kind of automatically showing us where we need to change things. So that's why I would suggest to start here with planning, because we introduce pedestrian sidewalks in planning mode, and that will then have ripple effects and show us that we need to change how road lanes are constructed. At that point, we can implement the pedestrian lane as the actual existing thing, and then that will show us that we need to change how pathfinding is implemented, and that we will need a second implementation of microtraffic and so on. So that's my hope here, that by starting somewhere small, together with the type checker guidance, we will actually see all the places that we need to change, and it will, for me, it always really feels like scaffolding that helps us to build the thing that we want to build. So let's start with that. So what do we need to change? We don't just want n forward and n backward lanes, but we want to have basically, kind of seen from the center of the road, a list of lane types. So obviously we first need to introduce lane types. So for that we create an enum lane type. And so far we have a car lane and a sidewalk. That was simple enough. We should probably define a bunch of those things. You don't need to worry about that really. Oh boy, now it's reformatting stuff, but whatever. And now let's redefine what our road lane config looks like. So I said we don't just want a number of how many lanes we want, but we actually want a configuration for our forward lanes and for our backward lanes. Each of those, like I said, should be a list. In our case, that's a CVec, which is just a vector, and we want a vector of lane types. So basically on either side of the road we can have one or more slots, each of which can be assigned one of those lane types. Okay? So let's give the type checker some time. This can't be copied anymore. And then we already see here in this file that this has a bunch of effects. Let me just check chat now that I have this window open to make sure I'm not losing you anywhere. So Uripas probably newly joined. I have this whole document of notes that we took earlier, and I think there's also an answer to yours, which pedestrian model we will use kind of in the end here, the different things we might consider, and I think we will first just build this one so you can have a look at that. So coming back here, we see that one of the first places that was affected is this calculate prototypes thing here, where based on a gesture intent that just describes we want a road through these points using this lane configuration, we want to create a bunch of lane prototypes for each individual lane on there. So you can see that so far it just creates a bunch of prototypes based on this like number of lanes we had set so far. But what we really need to do now is for each lane to also assign it the type that it should have. So I would suggest that we first walk through this function and see what it did so far, and then think about what we need to change. So first, we use this helper function, which gives us smooth paths through the points for each gesture intent. And then we need, like here, a lot of complicated stuff happens where I should probably draw that. So let me start back up the game and show you what is going on here step by step, because then it will make a lot more sense if I go through that. So let's reconnect to the game. Oops. and draw 2 roads and then go through it step by step together with the code. So I created a plan which consists of 2 gesture intents, one for this road consisting of the 4 points and so far still just the lane configuration containing the number of lanes on each side, and the second one which is just the same. So what's happening inside our calculate prototypes function now? You see that first we derive this intermediate value called gesture areas for intersection. So what we want is basically we want the area of kind of the band, it's called in the code because it's like a band that follows this path with a certain thickness that represents the total area of this one road. And we want to have this area for each road so that we can find out the geometry of the intersection if there is any. So this is what we do here. For each of the roads, we create a new band shape based on kind of the center path of the road. You see that it's an asymmetric band which has a different width on either side of the center. And basically we just calculate how wide should this band be based on the number of lanes it has on either the forward or backward side, and then multiply that with the distances that the lanes have to each other to get like basically the width of the band from the center to the right and from the center to the left in meters. That's first. Now we want to find the intersections between these 2 bands, or between any 2 bands of the roads in our plan. For that we use what's called an area embedding, which is really just an optimization or a helper that helps us find intersections between a lot of different paths, because like this is a very simple case, we only have 2 roads here, but we might have thousands of roads and we still want the intersection finding process to be fast. For that we use an area embedding. Now this whole thing, the road caps, that's kind of a detail, but you see at the end of each road we don't want the road to just end, we want the cars to be able to turn around and do a U-turn here to continue, so it's not just a dead end. So what we do there is that we actually create a fake intersection just with the road itself, and the game will still connect all the incoming and outgoing lanes like on an actual intersection, but just do that here. So this is how these, what I call road caps, are implemented. They're just artificial intersections that make sure that the road connects back up to itself instead of becoming a dead end. That's all that just calculates the shape of that road cap and where that should be. And once we know these artificial intersections, we just also put them into this road intersection embedding, which will calculate all of our intersections. So the way this area embedding to find intersections work is that basically you can imagine that for these bands and their shape, we color them with a color that's slightly transparent, and then where 2 of them interact we basically have an area that has a darker color, right? So we just define that an intersection area is, after we add all the roads with this color, is an area that is darker than 2. So where 2 or more of our basic shapes overlap, that's an intersection. So we take all of those and for those areas we actually collect which of our gestures take part in that intersection. Let me make sure everyone is still following. Okay, you're helping each other out, which is great. So I assume that so far it makes sense. So we of course don't just want to find the area of the intersection, but we also want to remember which road gesture intents took part in that. So luckily that's also something we get from our area embedding, where we get the IDs of all the gestures that influenced that area. And out of that we can already create one type of road prototype, which is, you see here there are different ones, which is an intersection. So the intersection prototype is already kind of a more concrete recipe of what we want to build if we implement the plan. And we remember the area of the intersection itself, and we just create an empty list or an empty map of incoming and outgoing roads, which we don't fill yet, and we already create a list of the connecting lanes that will be on the intersection. So we still haven't really thought about individual lanes at all yet so far, right? So far we just constructed the band representing the whole roads and found the intersection areas, and we kind of actually that was a bit of a mistake. We don't even really know, we didn't even really remember which roads interact with that intersection, but we know now where there's intersection shapes. So what we do now is now we actually go ahead and for each road create paths for the individual lanes, so that are no longer centered in the center of the road, but rather in the center of each lane, and we create one for each lane. So in the case of this road, we would create 4 separate lanes, in fact even 6 separate ones, because we have this virtual switching lane in between them, but for now just think about them as 4. And we create their band shapes covering just the width of each lane and put them in the plan. And then we intersect those with the already calculated whole road intersections. And as we do so, here we basically just construct the paths for the lanes by shifting the road path orthogonally by some offset. Once we have those, we see which intersections is this individual lane path cut by. And you can kind of think of them as spaghetti laying in parallel, which you literally like cut at wherever you have an intersection, and you end up with shorter spaghetti before and after each intersection. And for the intersections at this cutting point is a good time to associate this lane as an incoming lane for the intersection or an outgoing lane. That's the information we gather here. So you see that if it's intersecting with an intersectionist lane, we add the lane as an incoming or outgoing lane. Again, jumping over a lot of code here, but this is basically what it does. Here at this point we create, now that we have kind of the cut spaghetti, we create the virtual switching lanes that help with merging between lanes. We don't need those on intersections because it's just an assumption that you can't merge between lanes on an intersection, you just follow it. But here we create the switching lanes in these kind of cut parts. And finally, now that we have a bit more intersection information, namely, as I said, while we cut those individual lane spaghettis at the intersection, we also associated them as either incoming or outgoing with this intersection, we can kind of fill in a couple more details for each of the intersection prototypes. And here we have this whole helper function called create connecting lines, where based on the incoming and outgoing lanes that we know for each intersection, we can actually derive which connecting lanes there should be on it. And some people asked earlier if there will be a way in the future to manually configure the connecting lanes, and this is where that would hook in, where like the game by default would automatically generate some connecting lanes, but then you might in the plan manually change which ones you actually might have, or even add additional ones. But for now, all we really care about is that here we auto-generate the connecting lanes that should be on an intersection, connecting all the incoming and outgoing lanes. And that's really all we need. We have prototypes for each of the cut spaghetti lanes in between intersections, and we have a prototype for the whole intersection, including its incoming, outgoing information and the connecting lanes on it. And this is what all of this calculate prototypes function does. So we see a couple areas affected here by our change, where first the band, remember in the very beginning, the band representing the whole road, which we need to find the intersection of whole roads, so far was defined, its width in meters was defined based on the number of lanes. Now we actually don't have only numbers of lanes, but we have types of lanes, so we need to change that a little bit. But that will actually be quite simple, because let's for now assume that sidewalks are just as wide as a full car lane, which means that instead of having the number of lanes given to us, we just look, well, how many lanes are configured. So we can do something like backward lanes and then get the length of that list, like how many slots of lane types do we have in our list, right? So whenever we had the number of lanes before, we just replaced it by the length of the list. And same for the forward lanes. Type checker is kind of catching up there. Let me catch up on chat. So yes, when merging lanes, the city-bound cars actually do look in their mirror and only do it if there isn't a car approaching too quickly, which, like you're saying, it might even be unrealistic because some people don't do that in real life. Yeah, and the pedestrians will be simpler than cars, at least in the beginning, and if they get more complicated later, they will get more complicated in pedestrian ways that might not correspond at all to how cars work. Yeah, I don't have a second monitor right now. I could actually use my iPad as a second one. Let me try that, so I can have the chat there at all times. I don't know why I didn't do that earlier. Okay, that actually connected perfect, so I can now move this window over to my iPad and see what you're saying at all times. Let me know if that's somehow screwed with the screen, because now it basically has to have two monitors, but it looks like I'm not dropping frames, so I hope that that's okay. I see here in the preview that my display is kind of cut. Was that the case before, or did that just happen now when I added the iPad? Or no, that's actually fine, it just doesn't fill the aspect ratio completely. So yeah, and I will also do a general Q&A at the end of the stream. Okay, so let's see here. We changed this, so we just use the length of the list to get the number of lanes. Why is it? Okay, that's some Rust specific stuff. So I think I can just do as here 32, and then it should work. Sorry, just give me a second. It should be view 16, I guess, because we really won't have more than 16 bits worth of lanes. And I'll leave a small note here. Okay, so that type checks well now. So this was simple because here we really cared about the number of lanes. But let's see here for the road caps and their width, we again only really care about the number of lanes. So this was also simple, and it should be more interesting now when we create actually the prototypes for the individual lanes, which is what happens here. So here you can see that we iterate from 0 to the number of lanes. So what we actually want to iterate over here is that we want to iterate over the, we start with the forward lanes. We want to iterate over them and enumerate them at the same time. So I need to quickly look that up in the Rust documentation. Vector iter. Okay, that's, I think, okay, so we can then do enumerate. Can we do that? Enumerate, and then we have a map over a pair of, what do we have first? The index and the lane type. So now we iterate over our whole lane configuration, and we get both the lane index, which tells us where it should be, as well as our lane type. And probably we just want to kind of keep the lane type around for later here. So we kind of have that in our result. Like here we really just remembering the path, the index of the lane, like the path for the particular lane centered on the lane center instead of the road center. And then later we construct the prototypes for that. So all we need to do here really is change what we map over. So again, here we would map over the road intent, backward lanes, iterate, enumerate them, and we again have the lane index and lane type, and we remember the lane type. And here we create actually the corresponding path and put the path, and we still want to remember the lane type for the next step. Sorry if that's a bit intransparent, but these are all like intermediate values which we need to then actually construct the prototypes once we do the cutting I mentioned. Oh, I drop a lot of frames when RLS is indexing. Do you still hear me continuously, or is just the video broken? That would be good to know, because then I will just try to avoid scrolling while it's indexing. But okay, I mean, that's kind of bad. So for now, we just remember the lane type throughout all of these intermediate calculations. Then here we do the whole, to fix some brackets here, this. So now let's see, am I dropping frames now? Yes, indeed. So I need to figure out a way to maybe make OBS and the Rust type checker work along more nicely. So let's see what it doesn't like here. It should be like this. Okay, I dropped just the video, so I will try to avoid scrolling to not disorient you, but you should hopefully be able to follow my talking while it does that. Okay, so let's give it time to catch up. Now it's happy with all of this. So we said that we are remembering the lane type, so that means that we can also access the lane type here, and it actually complains because we ignored it so far, but we can't ignore it. And then let's see, where do we actually create the prototypes? When I was complaining about all of that here, this is a more difficult borrow checker issue, which I will ignore for now, because I really just want to make sure that the lane type is pushed along to where we create the prototypes. Okay, so here the intersected line paths, we actually need to remember the lane type here. This is what we return, the cut lane paths. And then here, when we construct the prototypes out of the intersected lane paths, we get the lane type here. And now is really when we need to look at the lane prototype and think what we need to change there, because basically we also need to remember the lane type and the lane prototype. So let's do that next. In the lane prototype, we want to remember a public lane type. So here we just pass that on. And now we should remember the lane types all the way through this crazy road intersection, starting with the configuration to creating the prototypes for the individual lanes that we care about. One more thing which we should take into account is two things. for the intersections, I mentioned that we keep track of the incoming and outgoing lanes, so we can later create the connecting lanes within the intersection. Obviously there, when we remember the incoming and outgoing lanes, we also want to remember the lane type, because we want to connect sidewalks to sidewalks and create crossings when we create the internal lanes of an intersection. So let's see again where we associate that. You see that here it's kind of two places in which we associate incoming and outgoing intersection lanes. So for the intersection prototype itself, you can see that the incoming and outgoing are kind of grouped by which side of the road they are, because we need to remember that. And for each side of incoming or outgoing road, we have an intersection connector and like a bunch of them, which is each individual lane. So let's have a look at that. And we remember whether those are straight or considered U-turn or inner or outer turning lanes. I think we assign those later. This is part of the calculating the internal lanes on an intersection. In the beginning we just assume they're all straight, and we will need to think about what that means for sidewalks. But let's just add here that for each incoming or outgoing lane, which is called intersection connector, here we also remember the lane type. So again, we introduce this change here, and now after type checking completes, it should show us actually through errors all the places where we now still need to give it the lane type of that incoming or outgoing lane on the intersection. So you can see down here, now these are other errors. It's first complaining up here. Okay, why is it not showing me more errors? Oh, here when we construct a new one, so we need to add it in the constructor for an intersection connector. You see that this is the default connection rule that they get, just none of those. These are determined later, but the lane type we should have right away. And now that we require it as a parameter to the constructor, hopefully once type checking completes, we should see exactly here, down here, all the places where we create a new intersection connector, but now you see that it's complaining because we're not giving it the third argument, which is the lane type. So we have the lane type here coming from our raw cut lane path, and we should be able to just pass that in all the cases where we create this intersection connector. Schraubelin is asking, are train stations, bus stops, etc. modeled as connections between those different lane types? So that's a whole nother topic. How will public transport be modeled? And it will probably be a kind of independent network of lanes once again, where, like, for example, a train station is connected to pedestrian lanes. You can walk into there, but not directly to road, so you would have to park a car, and a parking space would be kind of the connection between a road and the pedestrian path, which lets you hop from one mode of transport to the other. And then the train station, for example, would be what lets you hop from the pedestrian mode of transport into the rail lane network. So that's roughly how you can think about that. So let me just fix a bunch of small mistakes here, but I think this is roughly complete. And now just completing a bunch of small stuff here. This is basically just defines whether two lanes are considered similar to each other or not, which we need when we change a plan ever so slightly, but the lane is still mostly the same. We actually don't want to completely destruct them, but kind of just reuse them. So we have to now take into account here our new information which we added, which is the lane type. So that probably means that we need to implement partial, equal, and equal for them. Okay, just some small stuff. So I think we already did quite a lot today, and we even managed to break into the code and write quite a bit more than I was hoping for. Let me know if everything so far made sense. I think now is kind of a good point to stop, because we added as a concept that we want to have different lanes for pedestrians, and we implemented the direct implications of that in the planning, that we kind of keep this information along. So what we can continue with next time is we can update this, let's see, where do we have that? Intersection connections, where we calculate the connecting lanes. We can actually take this information into account and really sit down and write down the probably quite complex logic of how sidewalks should connect on an intersection with each other. So you have both the curves, just like the normal sidewalk connections, as well as the crossings across, and creating all the correct lanes for that, and incorporating that into the traffic light algorithm, where it already has a generic algorithm that basically just looks at all the connecting lanes at an intersection and then tries to find non-conflicting sets of these lanes and assign them to the same green phase, essentially. So I'm hoping that this should just work if you add pedestrian lines as well, where it adds them to the green phase if they don't conflict with any of the car lanes going in one direction. So hopefully we should see just reasonable behavior. I actually don't have the traffic lights in game right now. I had to re-implement them, but didn't do that yet. So it would be quite nice maybe for me to do that so we can see what's going on there. But that's basically our next to do, that we create the correct pedestrian lanes on intersections, meaning crossings or sidewalks going around the corner. And then we really take it from there and try to get a visual representation of them in the UI so we can see the difference between the lanes. And probably what would happen at this point, I guess, is that cars might go on sidewalks and use them just like other lanes, but then from there we can start distinguishing and only allow cars on these lanes, or even create a whole new different lane with micro traffic implementation, and we create either one or the other based on this lane type which we now have defined in planning mode. So that was quite a lot. I'd suggest I bring back the chat on screen here, maybe together with our notes, and we just do like a last 10 minutes of random Q&A, either about what we were doing or like the general goal of these live streams, or really anything you were wondering at all. So let me know what you have on mind. So I guess I just answered that about crosswalks, that they will be handled by the intersection internal lane generating code. So yeah, and once we have that, we can obviously extend that to have something like bike lanes or bus lanes, which are also just another kind of lane that restricts what can go on them. I mean, I'm always accepting PRs. Which aspect of vegetation exactly do you mean? Like how it's distributed, how it looks, that there are different kinds of vegetation? I mentioned earlier how vegetation is actually part of planning. So if you're planning to do something there, I hope that that gives you a bit of an idea of where to start. Any other questions? I live in Germany currently. Farm plants, growth, etc. So farm plants is one topic, which is kind of plants associated with lots or buildings, where if you build a field in game, let me start it up quickly, that actually, oh, it's already running. So let me build this. Oh boy, why is it so slow now? Reload that. If I build this and then plant some agricultural zone and let that develop, you can see that the fields will actually generate this like trees all around the field, and I want to extend that to normal buildings as well, so they generate plants in their gardens. And then it would be cool to actually make them dynamic and grow. The trees already almost supported, so there's not much missing there. How much time can you spend on Citybound these days? And kind of the same question from Schraubedrin. So I used to have a day job for quite a long time now, which limited me, and now I'm kind of in between things, and it's a bit chaotic, especially with the current situation. So I'm hoping that I can do these live streams plus some homework, which, given the concrete topic, should hopefully get us quite far quite soon. And also, I mentioned it on the subreddit a couple times, I worked on a lot of kind of miscellaneous stuff in the background now in Citybound. I mentioned that I just got the work in progress state working for this live stream now, and that includes a lot of stuff like cleaned up UI implementation, a better generic planning framework that all of this hooks into. So a lot of the things that I could explain today in this kind of very hopefully understandable and coherent flow only became that coherent over the last maybe half a year. So I actually pushed a bunch of stuff the last couple days, and now I'm only one commit ahead locally. And another thing which I did is that I actually got the new build process running, which uses GitHub Actions. So for the first time, I'm managing to compile Citybound on all three platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux there. And I only need to set it up so it uploads the binaries on GitHub. So we will have a fully automated build process again, and you can try out what we're working on during the live streams, hopefully. Yeah, that's another thing I've been working on. And the cool thing is that GitHub provides that completely for free, since it's an open source project, which is quite nice. Any more questions? So let's do until 35 on my clock. And I see that there's a delay, I guess especially towards the end, because I guess if you stream it, you might slowly get more behind over time. When do I plan the next live stream? maybe already next weekend. I'll need to see a bit how it works out for myself and how quickly I can do the whole voting thing again. But it seemed to me, based on the voting now, as if like either Saturday or Sunday my evening works best for most people. So yeah, just keep a lookout on the subreddit, but obviously I will send around emails again and post on Twitter. Okay, so based on my experience from the old days, I need to say one more question which I answer and then I get 5 more. But let's slowly wrap it up. Any last comments or things you'd like to know? Yeah, indeed, it also really feels like good old times for me. I really had a blast. I hope it was okay to follow, even though we did a lot. And I hope we have a good starting point for next time. Okay, well, if you have any more questions, keep them for next time or post them on the subreddit. Thank you all so much for joining us this time. It was a lot of fun for me. Let's see how far we can get this. I think it's great that we started with pedestrians, even though the virus is kind of a very current topic. I think Citybound will really benefit from having pedestrians in general. And I see you all next time. Stay tuned for the next announcement and have a good night. And most importantly, stay safe and stay healthy. Be careful out there. Bye, everyone.